Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Hey there, it's Brad. As someone who's passionate about podcasting, I've always thought there should be more support for physicians who want to share their stories and expertise. That's why we're launching Doctor Podcast Network.
We're bringing together a community of physician podcasters with one goal in mind: to provide the tools, connections, and resources you need to grow your show. So whether you've been podcasting for a while or maybe you're just starting, we've designed this network to support you every step of the way, and we're going to help each other rise, not compete.
If this sounds like something you'd benefit from, we'd love for you to join us as we get closer to launch. So you can sign up at drpodcastnetwork.co for early access. Stay tuned for more details in the coming weeks. Really looking forward to what we can create together. Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Doctor Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Do you have a handful of things that you really don't like talking to patients about? Let's turn that frown upside down with a framework for making these conversations less painful. Today on the episode, we've got Rob Orman. He's an emergency medicine physician, producer of the Stimulus podcast, which if you haven't checked out, if you like my show, you're going to love his. He's a performance and leadership coach specializing in high stakes environments like that emergency department. He's helping physicians get unstuck, unburnt, and kick butt in their careers. Rob Orman, welcome to the podcast.
Brad, such a delight to be here. Is this a PG rating? Because I know there's a different phraseology with that.
Yeah, you normally use the double hockey sticks or whatever it is. I try to not have to hit the explicit button.
All right, I will be on good behavior. Treat to be here. Let's rock and roll.
So let's start with a story, right? Was there a particular incident that led you to start scripting your least favorite conversations?
There was an event, but it was more reverse engineered. So my wife, Melissa, and I were partners in running the podcast and coaching and courses and the like. And she and I are always looking for universal pain points in medicine. And we were both emergency physicians for many years. She spent a lot of time in urgent care, and pain points are just something that we discuss because this is now our work. And she had this eureka moment. So we were working on scripting for something else. And I can't remember what it was that we were working on, but it was scripting for something. And she said, why don't we apply this to conversations that doctors dread, hate, or find exhausting? The conversations that just suck the joy out of work. And these are also conversations that have a little bit of voltage to them. And you're tired and you might not get it right. So there are things that exhaust and the things you might not get right every time. But if you have a script, it's going to take a lot less energy to do that. And you're going to be more likely to do it well when you have to execute. So we surveyed on social media. We used our own experience. I talked with my coaching clients and we found low-hanging fruit. And this was a lot of emergency medicine physicians. So there's a lot of people wanting antibiotics for upper respiratory infections. There was a lot of explaining asymptomatic hypertension when patients come into the emergency department and they think that their head's going to explode because their blood pressure is so high. Conversations about opioids with folks who've been prescribed them many times by many providers, and they're up on the PDMP. So it didn't start with a situation for me, but it went into situations that she and I had both experienced many times.
So you had a tool and you were like, this is how we can use the tool in other ways, right? You were talking about scripting for something else and you were like, we can definitely apply this in what we do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because a script saves energy, and so much of your day is about energy conservation. And that's not just food. It's also focus, concentration, and emotion. If you have to get into this emotional situation or frustration, that's going to drain you. And that just adds up over days, weeks, months, and years.
It's interesting. So I did an episode a couple months back with John Schneider. He's an otolaryngologist like myself. He's actually been a podcast host on this show. recently interviewed Dan Ariely, which was like one of those whales of that you never think they're going to reply and be like, sure, I'd love to be on your show. So he nailed that. And what we talked about when I had interviewed him was that we use heuristics, right? Because we will end up seeing the same things over and over, and we develop these scripts, like unintentionally. We use the word spiels. I'm not sure if you understand what that word means, right? We couldn't find a non-Yiddish word that would better fit what that is, but we have these spiels that we give to patients because we've honed them over the years. Like we've said them so many times and we've iterated on them until we found them they get them just right. And so maybe it's that in those situations, you haven't quite found your spiel. And so you've got to take a step back and be intentional. So instead of letting it evolve over time until after years and years of trying different things, you finally arrive at it. It might be that that never happens or it hasn't happened yet. And so instead of iterating, you've just kind of decided this is the best way to say it, at least for now. Is that kind of what's happening?
I think that's part of it. The spiel is so interesting. We recently had a family member who saw an otolaryngologist, and the otolaryngologist came into the room and said, okay, I'm going to explain this whole thing. Don't ask me any questions because you probably won't have any. And I'm going to explain the whole thing all at once and don't interrupt me. And then the spiel came out.
Yeah.
And okay, so I guess that could be a variation of a script. But in particular, this tool is for the conversations that you still find drain you, or you think you see that you're going to see a patient who has a particular issue, or the medical assistant or nurse has put, hey, they have this question or concern. It's every time that is the tool, the scripting that we're talking about. And I think when it comes to a spiel,
You could say that word. Yeah.
I could say it a lot, man. Not spiel,
No.
spiel.
No.
Spiel.
No.
Steven Spielberg? Spiel. So when you develop a spiel, sometimes you can take an approach which might not be the best approach, but it's just the thing that you have done over and over again.
Yes. So that's actually what we talked about in the episode. We said you've got these things. What that does is it lightens the cognitive load, which is what you were talking about earlier. Like we're always trying to save cognitive energy. That's the name of the game. When you're seeing so many patients in a day, you have to find ways to preserve cognitive energy. You're just not going to make it. But because you do that, you can actually mentally leave the visit where you're thinking about something else because you've said the same things over and over. And so what we said during the interview was don't do that. Use that extra cognitive energy to really try and read the room and make it more nuanced such that it fits that individual the best. Read their body language, read their facial expressions, pause, ask for questions, and really take that spiel and make it more as catered to the individual as you can. So don't just say that same thing over and over. Use that framework. That's how it came in.
With a script that's maybe not a spiel, you say basically the same thing every time. But I want to put a little nuance into the spielicization of these scripts. Anybody who is listening to your podcast, by default, has an extraordinarily high IQ. There you go, listeners. You're really smart. And you're smarter because you listen to Brad. But the problem with that can become a bug instead of a feature. When we were developing the frameworks for different scripts to teach people, it became really clear, and this is also working with clients who were struggling with these conversations, that there's a mismatch in how doctors speak and patients listen. Doctors speak the language of logic and fact, but patients often need something different because they are experiencing uncertainty and anxiety, maybe previous negative experiences in healthcare, and that needs to be addressed. And I'm not sure if you're a Star Trek aficionado or not. So
this is more of a Star Wars. We had an episode a while ago where we talked about healthcare in Star Wars. Did the stormtroopers, did they have health insurance? Did they have life insurance when that Death Star exploded? Was the Empire able to compensate their families?
Can I give a media recommendation based on that?
Please.
This is on YouTube, For the Empire. Have you seen this? It's fan created movies about what it's like to be a stormtrooper in the interstitium between the big scenes of Star Wars. It is so funny. For the Empire. Oh my gosh.
That was The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
Where they found Grogu, Baby Yoda, like the two speeder stormtroopers. One of them was voiced by Jason Sudeikis. The other one, I can't remember. He's from Boston. He used to be on the Mini Project. And the two of them were just like acting like regular people. They were stormtroopers. Don't touch it. Don't open it. Don't look at it. Yes, that's
Yes.
exactly what it would be.
That is exactly what it's like. Okay. But so Star Trek language, doctors are Spock logic. Patients are Kirk emotion. It's not always, there's a lot of overlap, but you are somebody, emergency medicine, urgent care. Somebody wants antibiotics for an upper respiratory infection. I got this. Antibiotics clearly don't work for upper respiratory infections. You're more likely to have resistance. Let's talk about drug resistance. Let's talk about public health. Let's talk about C. diff. And the patient's thinking, man, I feel like crap and I just want my antibiotic. Are you going to give them to me or not? Yeah. And so we're talking logic while they're hearing emotion and while they need to have their emotion addressed. It's just like in a relationship. Somebody's expressing something emotional to you. And if you answer that with logic, it's probably not going to be received very well.
Yeah. And it sounds like don't sell them on the flight, sell them on the destination, right? You're telling someone don't tell them what the flight's going to be like. Tell them what it's going to be like when they land on that island resort. So I think that's the same thing. You get mired in the details. And ultimately, do you really want to be pooping your brains and sick and a stuffy runny nose at the same time?
Okay.
But
I have something on that. Oh,
okay.
Gosh. Hang on. I don't want to interrupt your question, but that just
go ahead.
brings
Go
it
ahead.
up.
We'll get to the question.
So I'm thinking about opioids.
Yes.
And, with Suboxone and different options, it's a little bit different now, but it's still a challenge. What you would say, quote unquote, drug seeking behavior. When you know it's coming, can feel like such a drag. And often the doc gets clever in the moves and hopes that the patient's suddenly going to see their point, saying, the patient says, yes, you've convinced me that I don't need this Vicodin. Thank you so much. But that rarely happens.
Yeah.
And then with these conversations, it becomes a chess game that becomes so exhausting to play. And instead of setting a trap, there you go, there's a Star Wars reference, it's a trap, or trying to outmaneuver the patient, then you have a single structured approach with boundaries that transforms the conversations. And it reframes this from you, patient, are a problem to this is a problem. And let's pause on that. We could go deeper on that, but I want to hear what you've got coming
next.
next.
I want you to go into the framework. Let's get into the meat of the conversation and help us do this better.
So you want to talk about the specifics of how to build this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. We could talk about your specific frameworks that you have, right? The yes, no, yes framework. You want to start with that as an example?
Yeah. So there's so many ways to go about this.
Yeah.
And there has to be a baseline of where you're coming from. And we think in healthcare that we need to have empathy for our patients, that empathy is this good thing. I'm going to offer, and I wish this was my original idea. I learned this from Barry Curzon, who's the Dalai Lama's personal physician. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. Amazing guy. And we've talked about this a lot. And it's made me think about how doctors approach patients just in general, that empathy can be dangerous in medicine. And you think, wait, what are you just saying we should all be psychopaths? No. You standing in the shoes of another 30 times a day, somebody who is suffering is going to exhaust you.
Yes.
You're going to absorb all the emotions in the room. So compassion instead of empathy. Compassion is a half step back from empathy rather than I am standing in your shoes to just as I want to be well and happy, I want you to be well and happy. But I do not own your pain or your situation. But I will do everything in my power to help you move through this.
Yeah. So it's a subtle difference. So it comes from a place of compassion.
We did an episode maybe about a year ago on this exact subject, which was the difference between empathy and compassion and how one of them fills your cup. So if I see a patient and she just tells me that her husband died, right? If I think of what it would be like for my wife if I died, or what it will be like when my wife dies, that does not serve the patient nor me to put myself in that patient's shoes. All it does is it makes me really sad, right? And it maybe interferes with my ability to help them, right? And as you said, help the next patient and the one after that, 30 other patients that day. But if I think, wow, that's awful, what can I do to brighten this patient's day? Or what can I say to let them know that I really care about them and I think about them? That's going to fill my cup. And that's the difference between the two. Yes. So 100% agree. But I want to get back to the scripting thing. right? I
Yes,
want to get back
let's do it.
I want to get back to scripting. I want my listeners to
Yes.
leave here with some type of framework for, let's start with identifying their least favorite conversation. Because something that I do in my practice is when someone gets a poor review, it's brought to my attention. I ask them about it, or not a poor review, but like maybe a series of them. And so something that I'll ask someone in this situation is, listen, which conversations are the ones that you find have the most friction? And some of the doctors are like, yeah, you know what? I find like this is a problem, or maybe this is a problem. I get the most pushback from patients. And others are like, I don't know. So how do we first even identify that friction? Which of those complaints, situations would even require a script?
So I would take a step back from that. And if you're asking a doc, where's the friction between you and patients? That can be hard, especially if somebody doesn't have a high level of emotional intelligence to understand the other person's perspective. I would start from a place of, which conversations do you freaking hate? What conversations do you dread? When I ask doctors that, never have I experienced a trickle. It is a torrent. So it's coming from that perspective, it's an unending list. So I think that coming from only them is where you're going to get the answers.
Fantastic advice. That's really an excellent point. Okay. So as the doctor, we're going to think, right? As the listener right now, you're going to think about, what are the ones that you really dread? Okay. So now we've identified ones that we really dread, right? Before we really open the spigot and let the torrent flow. So then how do we start thinking about how we can script?
I'm going to give you two frameworks to think about to address this.
Okay.
And it can actually be in any form as long as it's coming from a place of compassion. And that's why I set that as the baseline. If it's coming from a place of, how do I get out of this freaking room as fast as possible and not get a patient complaint? If your script is coming from that, start over. Tossing that script enough. So the first framework, and this was, I took this idea from, I think, William Ury, is Power of Positive Yes, Harvard Negotiation Project, Harvard Business School, all of that. Like, how can we apply this? And this framework is yes, no, yes. And I like this because as physicians, we are natural pleasers. We don't want to get complaints. We don't want people to be upset with us. And this addresses all of that, your internal, what you're going to say, what you're going to do. And this yes, no, yes is about affirming the patient's concerns, setting a boundary, pivoting to a positive resolution. So yes, the first yes is to understand why you're saying no, what really matters to you. And why this is a yes is, it's what you're saying yes to. This is values-based, purpose-based. If you're saying no just out of hand, I say no because I'm the Roman emperor. Well, don't say no. If you're saying no because it's based on your core beliefs or it's avoiding clear harm to the patient, then say no. What is it you're saying yes to? And look, just going back to that example of antibiotics for a viral URL.
Great example. Because I'm sure we all have, in any practice that you're in any specialty you're in, you're going to have a patient that comes in and asking for something in particular that you are then going to tell them no.
Perfect.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's ivermectin. We don't know.
I didn't see ivermectin coming. I love that. Let's throw some colchicine on top of that.
Yeah.
All right. So what's the yes here? Because you can say, no, I ain't doing it. Nope, I ain't doing it. I am saying yes to, let's go big. I'm saying yes to embracing the Hippocratic Oath, to practicing medicine in accordance with values of doing no harm. That sets the foundation of your purpose. That's a yes. What is my internal yes? Then comes the no. And you are saying no to the issue, not the person. And this is a big mindset shift because it's much easier to say no to a question rather than that individual. It shifts from judgment to discernment. And with this, and when you're thinking about how the script is formulated, you want to avoid you statements in favor of the statement. For example, you are incorrect in thinking this antibiotic will fix you versus the idea that antibiotics effectively treat this kind of infection. It's common. And to the best of our knowledge, it's just not the case. So there's a no. No to the idea and not the person. And then the last yes is have a viable alternative. It's not, nope, ain't happening. Door closed. I'm out of here. It's no, these antibiotics are a no right now. We talk about how to say it. And here's what I'd like to do right now because I know that you're miserable. And then you walk through the plan. You are the expert at treating upper respiratory congestion. So there's yes. What are you saying yes to? Then there's no to the idea, not the person. And then
I'm happy
yes is the
to
viable
give those
alternative.
recommendations. If you just go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter, and you'll get Brad's 5 recommendations for what to do for a patient with a cold. That's not what you'll get if you subscribe to my newsletter.
Oh, that's not. That would be a great free resource.
It would.
That's
Lead magnet.
called-
Yes, I'm so
Yeah.
bad at those things. Please follow and subscribe and all those things, even though I don't do all those things that I'm supposed to. Regular newsletters. So yes, something that's going to help them do what I say, because what I say is the best, clearly. Right. And then I tell them, I just describe like, what's the difference when it becomes a sinus infection? Like, how do you tell the difference between a cold and a sinus infection? How do you know when it's time to come in? And then we go through what the recommendations are. What are your symptoms? What is making you miserable? So let's say we can find something that would make you less miserable. And then I do go through those cold recommendations, which medications that I do recommend for upper respiratory symptoms. So the yes is educating them on when the right time to pull the trigger and come in, because there is a right time. It's not that they're wrong all the time. There is a right time. And let's go through what that is. So the yes, yeah. So when you're coming up with, when you're saying the yes is the first yes, because it seems like the second yes is like the whole script, right? And the no is just like, no, you can't have it, right? The first yes, is it actually part of the script, or it's just more like you're framing your approach to the situation with that first yes?
It can be either. And if you like to put things in a sandwich with the 2 good things,
Yeah.
the bad thing
Well,
in
the
the middle.
compliment sandwich, right? Like
Yeah,
when you're
sure.
criticizing someone,
Sure. So it can be good news. I don't see any sign of pneumonia or sinusitis. And that means you don't need antibiotics right now. This is great because antibiotics, we think they help, but right now they're just going to make you miserable. And so there's the thing of somebody comes in with asymptomatic hypertension, common in the emergency department. People are freaked out. Why aren't you going to do anything for me? And you're going to do something, but not what they think, which is get admitted to the ICU. You can go home on these medications. Hey, great news. I don't see anything serious going on. Here's what I look for: stroke, heart attack, the things that high blood pressure can cause emergently. None of that's going on. So right now, we don't need to admit you. We don't need to change this medication. But here's what we do need to do, which is have you check your blood pressure twice a day, record it, and follow up with your primary care doctor and come back for these worrisome signs.
but the person at
yeah.
urgent care who
Yeah.
I see twice a month for all of my things, who I trust, told me that you were going to need to admit me to the hospital. And that's why they sent me here. And you're not admitting me to the hospital?
Thank you. Because you think, oh, here we are, a couple of geniuses with our yes, no, yes from Harvard graduates. Always expect resistance and pushback, because someone probably put another idea into their mind. Maybe it was a podcast, or maybe it was urgent care. Maybe it was, who knows? Who knows? So one, you want to stay firm with your boundaries and practice good medicine in the emergency department, classic, or someone gets sent in for a head CT. And the number one rule with this is never, ever throw another clinician under the bus. And that's not going to serve anyone well. And it's also going to create some sort of antagonism. If you're on the witness stand, okay. But in this situation, yeah, I could see why they were concerned and why they were thinking that. This is what we're doing all day. And it's a common conception that this blood pressure in this situation is super dangerous. But what we find is, and then you go into the explanation, but acknowledge and don't dismiss, don't throw the other person on the bus. And it is a total yes and instead of a yes, but.
Also, this framework is not a guarantee that it's always going to go well, right?
No,
It's just
that's
more,
right.
It's lifting some of that cognitive load, and it's helping you to not dread it because you have a plan, which is a lot of what we talk about on the podcast, is that going into outpatient encounters in the same way we would go into the operating room. You go into the operating room with a plan on how you're going to go through surgery and every step. And this is what I will do if I encounter this particular problem. This is what I'll do if I encounter that particular problem. We don't go into visits this way. We don't go into visits with an intentional plan of how I'm going to open the door, how I'm going to greet the patient, what kind of energy I'm going to bring, how I'm going to ask them why they're here. When I do encounter friction, what am I going to do with each particular brand and reason for the friction? We don't get trained in those things, and we should be. And the whole reason I started this podcast is to figure that stuff out. And I'm just going to tell what I said on your podcast is that I wouldn't have even had this podcast if you had made your show previously, because you talk about all those things that I love to talk about in these communication challenges. But before we go, because we're running really short on time, I just want you to touch on just one other framework that we can use to help us script these dialogues.
This comes from the field of hostage negotiation. And it is a shift in mindset from I have special knowledge to tell the patient, which you do have special knowledge, but it is a shift from I have special knowledge to they have special knowledge that I need to understand. So in the case of antibiotics for a respiratory infection, is what brought them in. They have special knowledge that I need to know. It is what's behind the why that they want what they want. And how do you know that you have gotten to this patient's special knowledge? It's when they say something like, that's exactly right, or something to that effect. And you try to get there before even your physical exam. So you're asking questions and you're querying and you're almost interrogating in a compassionate, nice way until the patient says, yes, that's it. That's exactly right. It's exactly what I'm thinking, exactly what I'm worried about.
Excellent. So it sounds like that's what I refer to as the question behind the question.
Yeah.
The reason that they really came in that they might not verbalize unless you really pull it out of them by asking something like, what worries you about this? Or something along those lines, right? Like you're giving them permission to, sometimes they won't say it because they think you might judge them for their reason for coming in, or you won't believe them or something like that. So you have to phrase it in such a way that gives them permission to say, I'm worried that I might have cancer. Or it's because every time I was told that anytime there's green stuff that comes out of my nose, it's a sinus infection. That's what someone else told me. So find out the question behind the question, the thing that drove them to come in. Yeah, you've had symptoms like this before, right? Where you didn't go to the emergency department, where you didn't go to urgent care, where you didn't come to see me. So what was the difference between this and now? What was the thing that said, you know what, it's time to go in? Yeah. So I think unearthing, that's how I've learned to unearth that special knowledge. Do you have anything else that you would add to those types of questions?
When you have truly uncovered that with your, not only just asking this question of, okay, I need to get the special knowledge, but it is a mindset shift of you going to exam rooms. Okay, I'm on time. I got all this wisdom to share, to this patient has special knowledge I need to know. And really being a detective trying to uncover that. And it's so hard when there is a time pressure. It ends up being a time saver in the end. It does take more time to ask it rather than they start giving their answer to some question. You interrupt them in about 3 seconds and you just start talking and giving your spiel.
Yeah. Because a lot of the communication, in fact, is not information collection. A lot of the communication is trust building.
Right.
And if you start viewing it that way, it'll actually make those visits shorter. Because as you said, it's an upfront investment for time saving and patient satisfaction in the end. Not all of your dialogue is information collection. Some of it is trust building and just letting them talk in order to let that happen.
Love it. And we have, I wasn't going to promote this, but for the sake of completeness on my website, roborman.com, we have a free resource, which is scripting your least favorite conversations. It goes into all of this and it's got a bunch of different examples. If you want to look and see, how could I script it for this? How could I script it for that? And it starts getting the vibe of what this might look like and how you might create it for yourself.
So roborman.com, you've got a couple of other free resources on there. What else you got?
Oh, we've got the driveway debrief, which is a 10-minute guided exercise to transition from work brain to home brain, documentation templates, how to give an A+ presentation to your consultant. So you're not a wandering historian. And so you're just laser focused and it is beyond reproach.
Amazing. And all that's at roborman.com. And where you found this podcast, you can also find the Stimulus podcast with Rob Orman. Amazing. Thank you for all you do for our colleagues in our profession. And thank you for a great interview.
Oh, it has been such a treat and glad to finally be on this amazing show. Great to talk to you, my friend.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice or financial advice or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.